You get pizza every 2 weeks. And it's stuffed crust today. It's pretty good. Cold out here on pizza. Stuffed crust, they're like. There was someone who told me that she really was gonna go to this, she really wanted to learn about BP. It's okay.
Can you put the announcement slide up? Yes, that should be up. Oh, yeah. Okay, first thing, there's a day preference form if you want the meeting to be on a different day. Because apparently lots of people can't make Wednesday, fill it out. Also, if you want the meeting to be on the same day, also fill it out, so we actually know if people want that.
I think the other candidate is Monday.
Yeah, the other candidate.
Either day or Monday. If you can't do Monday, please do the form and say that you like Wednesday.
There are 2 tournaments coming up. Steve Hunt Classic and the Bowling Green State University Falcon Classic, October 7th through 9th, October 15th through 16th. For this one, October 7th is a Friday. The individual events are on Friday. Debate is on Saturday, and then the finals for debate are on Sunday. This one is a swing tournament, meaning there's a tournament on Saturday and there's a tournament on Sunday. Those are both pretty cool. Both of them offer speech, both of them offer IPDA, and this one, Stephen Hunt Classic, offers BP. We went to the Stephen Hunt Classic last year and we did really well, so I hope we can go again, because Lewis Park University is pretty cool. Yeah, there's a funny story there.
Maybe I should go again. Is there BP at this tournament?
Yes. Dues, reminder, treasurer. Okay, I'm gonna hand over to Vishnesh. He's doing today's workshop. And I'm gonna go sit down and feel free to grab pizza if you want to.
Okay, so, today's workshop is an intro to British parliamentary debate. You guys done British parliamentary debate before?
Yay, me.
Since we only have a few, I guess you can go as slow or as fast as you want. But this is just going to be like a very basic introduction. And so the goal of this workshop is just to give you enough knowledge to be able to compete in British parliamentary tournaments, because you want to make sure you know enough to like just sign up for a tournament and be able to like navigate through all the terminology or like other stuff they'll be using. Also, like after this workshop, you should be able to just go online and watch a bunch of like British parliamentary videos and kind of understand what's going on. And then, just like start practicing. Cool. So I'm going to go over a general introduction to British parliamentary debate, talk about what that is, what it means, what the speaker roles are. So what you might have to do if you're a speaker in this debate and how that varies depending on which team you're speaking for. I'll go over what points of information are, and then lastly, just leave it open to questions if you guys have. So firstly, introduction to BP. So British parliamentary debate, if you haven't been able to tell already, is modeled off the actual British Parliament. And this isn't really important in terms of debating, but it's useful to know because a lot of the terminology will be related to this when we're talking about like speaker roles or what different people do. But like, if you don't know what the British Parliament is, just like, don't worry about it. So a couple of key things. First thing is that British Parliamentary has 4 teams. So unlike a normal, like most other debating formats where you have only like 2 teams going against each other, British Parliamentary is like more interesting because you have 4 teams going against each other, and I'll explain like how exactly that works. You have 15 minutes of prep time, and you also don't have internet access. So this also includes like talking to coaches or judges. So it's one of these formats where you go in with like very little information about what the topic's going to be. And you rely a lot on like your own brain power, communication with like your teammate, which is why I think it's really interesting, because you see a lot of like interesting and unique arguments that come across like during these debates. Also, it kind of like it seems kind of stressful when you have only 15 minutes, but it's actually pretty interesting to see how much you can come up with in 15. So I'd highly recommend this. One of the other reasons it's nice is because you don't have to go into like a tournament with a lot of prep. You can literally just show up and then like go through a bunch of rounds, and yeah. Last thing is speeches are usually 5 or 7 minutes long. It depends on the competition. I think most competitions are 7 minutes long, but there are like other high school level tournaments which do like 5-minute speeches. But I think mostly you guys will be doing 7-minute speeches. Anyway, structure of teams. So I talked about how there are 4 teams. So there's opening government, opening opposition, closing government, and closing opposition. So the way British parliamentary debate works is you have 4 teams going against each other at once. And so when you have a topic, and we'll talk about like what a topic looks like in British parliamentary and like how exactly you figure out what it means. But let's say you have a topic. All the teams which are on the government side will support the topic, and all the teams on the opposition side will argue against the topic. And so it looks similar to like a normal debating format where you have some teams arguing for and arguing against. But what's different is that you have 2 teams on each side. And so essentially, if I was closing opposition, my goal is to not only talk about why my side or my views are right, I also need to talk about why whatever I said is more important than what opening opposition said. And so it's kind of interesting because you're not just debating about why you're right, you're also debating a lot about why you're important and like why you're better than the other team who is also arguing for the same thing. And so there's a lot of nuance involved in British parliamentary. That's why it's one of my favorite. Apart from this, there are like a few other rules. So closing opposition. So, okay, the way the debate works is you have 2 speakers on each team. So you'll have 2 speakers on opening government, 2 speakers on opening opposition, 2 on closing gov, and 2 on closing up. And so the way it works is you have one speaker go after the other. We'll go through this like later in the presentation. But the idea is that closing teams always go after opening teams. And so one of the things you can't do in British parliamentary is openly contradict what an opening team has said. And so even though you are competing against teams on your side, you're still trying to extend their argumentation. So you never want to like contradict or say something that's against something someone on your bench has said. And when I say bench, I'm like, this is a bench. Opening opposition and closing opposition form a bench together. And so you never openly contradict like what the other person is saying, though you are competing with them, which sounds very confusing. But yeah, you guys have any questions about that? Cool. So what is a motion? So I talked about like a topic which you get. That's basically a motion. And so motions are just like fancy words for the topic of the debate. It usually starts with this house. Again, this is just because like it's based on the British Parliament, but don't worry a lot about what exactly this house means. This is what topics usually look like. So it would be something like this house would abolish the Olympic Games. So this house as China would grant universal suffrage to Hong Kong. And the reason I think these examples are important is because the house is something you define. And so you're defining like who you should view the debate in the eyes of. And so for the second motion, you can clearly see that you're kind of defining the house to be China. And so the entire debate kind of takes the perspective of what's good for China and what's bad for China. So if you're doing this debate, if any team ran an argument on like why this would be good for the United States, that's kind of irrelevant and not part of the debate because like the motion clearly states that this house is China. In some motions, they might not explicitly tell you what this house is. And so it's open to interpretation. And so you usually want to choose a house which is like relevant and who would care like about the topic of the debate. But this is what they normally look like. There's also like some common terms used over here. So THW is usually this house would. THR stands for this house regrets. Like you don't need to remember all of this. They'll just like give you the entire motion's names, but sometimes you might see that. So like don't get confused if you see those. I wanted to specifically talk about this house regrets because I think that's an interesting one. This house would and this house believes that is like pretty self-explanatory. So for example, in this one, if the topic is this house would abolish the Olympic Games, it's literally about would you abolish the Olympic Games or not? But the reason I think regrets motions are interesting is because regrets motions are about creating counterfactuals or like alternative realities and talking about what would have happened there and why you regret the current world. So let me give you an example. Let's say the topic is this house regrets slavery. If you were going on proposition or like opening government, it's not enough to just talk about why slavery is bad. When you're talking about regretting slavery, one of the key things you need to do throughout the debate is kind of talk about what the world would have looked like if we didn't have slavery and why that world is better. And so in any kind of regrets motion, you're trying to build like an alternative reality of what would have happened if like this didn't happen and why that world would have been better and therefore why you regret what actually happened. So that's just kind of important. Like in general, in debates, you're supposed to be comparative because there's no point just arguing about what the other person said if you don't have something to compare that to. But I think regrets motions are like an interesting application of that.
We had I think you have the same one, Vishnesh, but Red Scheller Invitational, we had this house regrets a motto normativity, which was like a real curveball. Do you guys have that round?
Yeah,
What's a
so-
lot of activity?
It's basically monogamy.
It's like monogamy plus stuff though.
It-
And like the
it's
important part is you gotta talk about the part that's not monogamy.
Yeah, I think it's also like it has like.
It's like
heteronormative
commitment or whatever.
implications.
No, but it's also like regarding like commitment.
But
Whatever.
no, it was like, how did you guys do it then?
I think we got like the vendors.
You okay, Emma and I did really well.
Yeah,
It was
because we
just
just said that the other team's homophobic the entire time.
So like, so that was a very
They
weird
were.
thing, because like the definition of amatonormativity kind of included not being homophobic, so when you oppose it, you kind of actively homophobic.
Well, yeah,
but
because
then
like a mononormativity is like monogamous. I don't think it's like strictly heterosexual, but it's like committed monogamous relationship should be the standard. Or should be like
Like
the norm.
nuclear family type of.
I guess.
Kind of, but I think it extends even.
I think that was just like a bad topic,
I
but
thought it was a
It
great,
was a terrible
it
topic.
was a terrible topic if you were on the side that we.
Yeah.
We did it as a bad.
So
Oh,
it's a
yeah.
bad topic.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I thought it was interesting though. You don't normally, I think you don't.
Yeah, I feel like it was interesting, but it's like impossible to neck that.
Yeah, fair enough.
anyway, so like, I guess key takeaways from whatever we have done, British Parliamentary has 4 teams that go against each other. This is what a topic looks like. And then now we'll go on to speaker roles and what exactly happens. So this is like a nice graphic I found online. And so, like these 2 speakers over here will be your, let's go back to that slide. So basically each of these have 2 speakers, right? So the thing I'm going to show you now is basically showing you how the different speakers are split up for these 4 teams. So these 2 speakers over here would be closing opposition, they would be opening opposition, and then the 2 speakers over there would be opening government, and those 2 speakers would be closing government. So those are the 4 teams, and these are just like different names you give each speaker. So the first person who speaks for opening government is called the Prime Minister. Again, this is because like it's British Parliamentary or whatever. And the reason, like, this is not useful at all in a debate, but the reason it's useful to know is because, like, in a debate, you'll hear someone say something like, the PM said this, blah, 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 blah. Basically, they're trying to say the first speaker of opening government said this. And so just because, like, these abbreviations are very common, it's useful to know, like, the different names of different speakers. I know this can be a lot, so I wouldn't worry too much about this initially. But as you just like keep doing more British Parliamentary, you'll kind of know what all of these mean. But let's quickly go over them anyway. First speaker of opening government is Prime Minister, and then you have the Leader of Opposition. So basically the roles are very similar if you look across opposition and government. You then have the Deputy Prime Minister, after which the Deputy Leader of Opposition goes. And then essentially once the Deputy Leader of Opposition finishes their speech, the opening sides are done debating, because you can see this now moves to like the closing sides. So then you have the member of government, the member of opposition, the government whip, and then the opposition whip, and then the debate gets over. So the way speakers speak is in like this zigzag pattern. So the entire debate is just comprised of these 8 speeches. Unlike other debating formats, there's no like cross-examination round or like these other weird rounds they have in between. It's just like 8 speeches by 4 different teams, and then once those are over, the judges just decide like which teams have won. Also, because I guess I didn't mention this earlier, at the end of the debate, what the judge does, what the judges do together is they rank all the 4 teams based on which team they think that the best, second best, third best, and fourth best. And so unlike a normal competition where you either get a win or a loss, here you get assigned a ranking, and based on your ranking, you get points. So I think if you finish 4th, you get like 0 points, but if you finish 1st, you get 3 points. And so that's kind of how you get points, and then you just keep doing a bunch of debates, and then they add up your points, and then the top few teams like qualified, which is kind of reassuring because you'll notice that even like really, really good debate teams don't just always rank 1st in most of their like debates. There'll be debates when they rank 4th. There'll be like maybe 2 or 3 debates in a competition when they rank 4th. So it's really, it's a really interesting format because you can't really predict how often you'll win or how often you lose, also because there are like 24 possible variations after each round. So yeah. Any questions about this? And what exactly the speaking order is? No? Cool. Okay, so now we'll go into like the specific roles of what each person does. So first I'm going to talk about the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition, because they kind of have very similar roles. The only difference being that the Prime Minister talks first and the Leader of Opposition talks second. And that's useful because that means that the Prime Minister is literally the first person to talk in the debate. And so they have a lot of work to do in terms of like clarifying what the debate is about. The Leader of Opposition also has to do that, but because the Leader of Opposition talks after the Prime Minister, they have like rebuttal to do because they have like someone who spoke before them, and so they need to like refute those arguments. So the Prime Minister is like the only speaker who will never have anything to refute because there's nothing to refute because nothing is been said. So roles of Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition. So the goal is just to set the debate up, and setting the debate up involves like defining key terms and characterizing the debate. So what that means is when you look at a motion or a topic, you need to explain what exactly that means and why we're arguing about that. And we'll go over like things to think about when you're doing that. But like, yeah, we'll just go over that on the next slide. But this is what I guess a Prime Minister's speech would kind of look like. So you would have an introduction, just like your first 15 seconds, where you quickly just get to the topic. So I know that in a lot of other formats, introduction is usually when people will come and say stuff like, "Hello, I'm very happy to be here talking about this, blah blah blah." But in British Parliamentary, you kind of just get straight to the point, because if people already know that you're the Prime Minister and they know you're arguing for the topic, there's no like point in repeating like who you are or what you're doing in the first 15 seconds. And so there's actually a video I wanted to show about like one of I think one of the best introductions I've ever seen, just so I give you guys an idea of what an introduction looks like in BP. This works. Okay. So
You can turn it down on the YouTube video.
okay. That's pretty loud. I think that just means to. That's good enough. So the topic for this debate was discussed about the establishment of a black secessionary state within the territory of the US. The founding, that's supposed to be funding. I don't know.
Yeah, the founding.
Yeah, so this is just about like creating a separate country for African Americans. So I guess the debate's about like reparations, but also just like the injustices in the system that's going on right now, trying to solve that. And so that's like the context for this debate. And so the Prime Minister in this debate kind of has a lot of work to do, but essentially in their introduction, they're trying to cut to like the problem this debate's trying to solve and talk about like why this is an issue and why we should even be debating this. And I think he does a really good job at this. So I'm just going to play his introduction. Cool. I don't know if you guys were like mind blown by this, but I was the first time I saw this. Couple of things to note. I just mentioned how like this debate is supposed to talk about like reparations and giving back, but also like the system right now and why it's unfair. And if you notice, like in his introduction, he does a very good job of touching on both of those ideas with a lot of like visual rhetoric about like the problems they're going through right now and why this debate even exists. So ideally, your introduction would try to do something like this. Like obviously, you're not expected to have like a very well-crafted intro like this because you have only like 15 minutes to prepare. But try to like I don't want to say use a quote because that's something people do a lot, but just try to like have some kind of rhetoric, some kind of like, yeah, essentially some kind of rhetoric that quickly paints a picture of what the problem is that the debate's trying to solve, or just like get to the point basically. Yeah, and I think this debate is generally a very good debate. So if you guys want, you can look this up. I think I'll be sending I'll be sending the slides as well, right? After that. Yeah, cool. So you can just like
remember to do it.
yeah. So yeah, don't worry about like taking notes or like remembering everything on the slides because you'll just be sending.
And there's also a recording.
Oh yeah, that's also there. And then you can like click on that and watch the entire video. I think it's a really good debate. But the next 15 seconds to a minute is like definitions and case split. So definitions will be defining like the key terms of the topic, and I'll talk more about that later. Case split is basically just telling the judge what your arguments are going to be. And this is really, really important to do because let's say I have 3 arguments and I just come up, give my speech and present all of those 3 arguments. While they might be really good arguments, as a judge, it's very hard to sometimes track when people switch between different ideas. And a lot of times if analysis is like similar between different arguments, they have no real idea of like how many arguments you actually came up with or like what the unique things you said were. So when you're doing a case split, essentially what you're doing is you're going up and you're saying, hey, today I'll be talking about these 3 arguments. I'll be talking about the first 2, which are X and Y, and my partner will be talking about the 3rd argument, which is Z. So you're just making it very clear about what your arguments are, what you'll be talking about, what the other person will be talking about, so that the judge can then and there just write down whatever your arguments are. And then as you go into those arguments can like fill in those gaps. But you basically create like a structure for them to keep track of your speech. So that's really important to do. I think people forget to do that sometimes because like obviously the arguments are more important, but just like having good structure throughout your speech is a good rule of thumb. And then from the 1st minute to the 6th minute, 45 seconds, basically before the last 15 seconds, you present both of your arguments. If you're the leader of opposition, you also need to do some rebuttal because obviously the Prime Minister has just spoken. And so you need to kind of refute some of the things that came up in the Prime Minister's speech. I think we'll do a session on rebuttal at some point in the future. But yeah, that's kind of the goal of the leader of opposition. That's like the only difference, I think, between the Prime Minister and leader of opposition speeches. Like, also these things aren't fixed. So the judge isn't going to be like, oh, you did your case split at like 1 minute, 30 seconds, you're disqualified or something. This is just like structure for you to try and keep so that it's easier for you to know what to do in your speech and give yourself enough time to focus on your arguments while also doing other important things. And then a conclusion will just like summarize the key ideas that came up in your speech, again, so that the judge can like keep track of your speech and notice like exactly what you've done in your speech. And so you just make it very clear about what you've contributed to the debate in your conclusion. Okay, things to think about when you're trying to make a speech for the Prime Minister or leader of opposition speaker role. So first one is just what problem is this debate trying to solve? Like I think I've said this a few times, but really that's the first thing you should ever be thinking about during prep time. Because if you can't figure out what the problem is that the debate is trying to solve, you not only have no idea about why you're doing this, you also have no idea about what the opposition is going to talk about, right? Because if you don't know what the problem is, you can maybe talk about like what you're doing and why that might be good. But if that's not directly related to the problem, it'll have nothing to do with like what the other team says. So first, always try to figure out what the problem is that the debate's trying to solve. And while doing that, don't squirrel the scope of your debate. So like this is a bad example, but let's say the debate's about like banning smoking. You're clearly not talking about like smoke that comes from chimneys or whatever, right? Like you're talking about like people smoking cigarettes or whatever. And so it sounds like a really stupid example, but a lot of times you'll notice that people will try to define the debate in a way in which it affects like a very particular group of people, which is just beneficial to them. And you're never supposed to do that because that's just bad practice. And you can easily get called out on doing that by the opposing team. And a lot of times, if it doesn't make sense, the judge will just agree with the other team and be like, yeah, I agree with that definition more. And it just looks bad right from the get-go if you seem to not even have a clear understanding of like who the debate is about. So
Such a contrast from other formats we do,
yeah,
where like abusing the definition of the words in the.
It actively encouraged.
It's what everyone does. This is why BB is like an actual debate on fire. Do you remember when we had that resolution that was like this house would support a 4-day work week?
Yeah.
And it was for BP, and Sean was like, oh, if I had that, I'd interpret that as like Congress for 4 days a week or something.
They work less. than
And
that.
you were just like, you can't do that.
I was raging.
Yeah, because that kind of like takes away from the whole point of debate. It's like to argue about an issue. And then you're like, but no, we don't want to argue.
The point is just to abuse definitions, and if you got it.
Which is the next point about what definitions are actually used. And so the point of definitions isn't to like look at a topic and be like, okay, I'm gonna look at the dictionary definition of each of these words and say that in my speech so that I've defined the motion. It's to like make it very clear about like what you're talking about. And it's usually to like define ambiguous words, or if you're talking about like policies, you need to have a very clear definition of like what your policy is going to look like. And so I think that video which I was like showing you guys earlier is a really, really good example, because that's a very complicated policy, right? Creating like an entirely separate state within the territory of the US, and also like talking about how the US is going to like help support them. And so that's a debate where a definition is super important, because they need like the prime minister or the leader of opposition really need to clarify like what exactly they're doing. Like if we want to ban something, how are we going to ban this? Like what is our punishment going to be if like people don't follow this rule? And then how are we going to like enforce this ban? All of those things are really important to like think about whenever you're thinking about like any kind of debate, but especially in ones with like a policy. So yeah, if you're confused about like what definitions are and when you need to do them, just like think about like when you get the topic, look at the topic, underline all the words which don't immediately make sense to you, and then see if there are like multiple interpretations for any of the words you've underlined. If there are, you really need to spend time talking with your teammate about which you think is the most likely one that the people who set the motion wanted it to be. So if I underline smoking and I talk to my teammate about like what this is probably going to be about, we both would realize that it's probably about like people smoking cigarettes or something like that. And so try to make sure that you come to a consensus on what the most likely definition is and what the debate's going to be about. And if it was something that you guys were confused about, then it's definitely important to like bring it up when you're giving your speech, because then it probably is something that the opposition team is also trying to figure out. And in good debates, and this is like one thing that's very different from like other forms of debate, but in good debates, you're usually not going to argue with the other team about like definitions or like what the problem is that the debate's trying to solve. Like there are cases where you will like not like that policy and you can like poke holes in that policy, but usually the debate comes down to like the actual arguments. And so you're not really going to like argue about, oh, what does this word actually mean in the debate or whatever. But yeah, still make sure you have like a good definition, because if I say I want to ban something and I have like no explanation on how I'm going to do it whatsoever, even though that's not what the debate's about, obviously the other team can be like, these guys don't even know what they're doing. They have like no explanation about how they're going to do it. So make sure you have good definition. Why should the judge care about what your team has to say? And this is something I'm going to list for every speaker, because there's a difference between making a good argument and also making the judge care. And I think there's two aspects to this. The first one is just explaining the impacts of your argument. So I can have like a logically sound argument with no impacts whatsoever. And so unless I explain like how this actually affects people and how these people are related to the topic, that argument takes me nowhere. So make sure you're like explaining the impact of your argument and linking it back to the topic, because then it's clear about like what you said and why that even matters in the debate. But the second aspect of this is making them care about what your team has to say in the context of what's already been said. And this is very, very important when you're a closing side as well. And like as an opening side, I guess you get the advantage of being the first team to talk, but you really need to make it clear about like why your arguments are the most important arguments in the debate. Because let's say I'm like an opening side and I have like a random topic and I go up and I make an argument about like why this tax policy is going to help rich people. Like that might be the most logically sound argument ever. But if I'm not explaining why rich people are the most important people to care for in this debate, and they usually never are, then the judge just isn't going to care about what you're going to say. And so that's why it's important to like explain who you're talking about and why they're the most important people to talk about in this debate. Because then when they're trying to evaluate you, not just against the other sides, but against like your closing or like your opening, whichever team also is arguing for you, it's very easy to see why what you said was the most important, which is also this. But yeah, cool. Next, we go to Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of Opposition. again, I know these are a lot of words, so don't worry about these. I will send the slides over. Just try to understand like what the debate looks like and what each person's trying to do as the debate progresses. But essentially at this point, you're the second person talking for your team, which means one, you have a lot of material that's already been covered and you need to get to, but also two, this means that you are the last person who's going to speak for your team before the debate then moves to the closing side. And so that leads to like a lot of important things you need to do in your speech. The first one is just refuting the other team, especially if you're deputy leader of opposition, because at that point you've had the entire opening government team talk, and this is your last speech. So you really need to make sure you're like clearly refuting all of the ideas that you've come up with. Second, reconstruct your own team's analysis. Like you've had a speaker go before you, you've had someone refute them. You now need to do like some reconstruction, because otherwise it just looks like whatever they said like stands and you don't really have any arguments anymore. And the third thing is just extending the argumentation for your team. So usually, I think deputy speakers have like one extra argument. Maybe you can do like two, but I don't think you usually have like a lot of important arguments. Not because like the deputy leaders can't give good arguments. It's because if you really had like good material, you would have pushed that up to your first speech, because like the prime minister and the leader of opposition make like the best, like most important, come up with the most important ideas. This structure is like more flexible. You have an introduction, you have a conclusion. But yeah, even in the middle, it varies a lot. Try to spend 2 to 3 minutes on rebuttal, more if you're the deputy leader of opposition, because obviously there's a lot of content to cover. But also make sure you like cover your one argument within this time as well. Okay, so those were the like opening speakers, and then I'm gonna go on to closing. Oh wait, for that, things to think about. Again, what are the biggest ideas that have been discussed so far? What do I have to clarify for my team's argumentation to still stand? Have we made it clear as to why we are the most important? And I think I listed this for all speakers, but yeah, very important. Okay, this is just like very similar to what I was saying before about those 3 things you need to do. So if you're the deputy speaker, literally write these 3 things as a to-do list. And before you go up to give your speech, make sure you're doing all those 3 things. Because it's not like the judge is tracking you and doing these 3 things, but if you do those three things, then you are definitely fulfilling your role of like being a deputy speaker. And so it's important to do that. But essentially, once these 4 speeches are over, the opening side of the debate is over. And so a general strategy for being the opening side is you are the first person who's going to talk for your side. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but the opening and closing sides don't prep together because they're like competing against each other. And so what that means is if I'm closing government, I have no idea what opening government is going to say as soon as we walk into that room. The only time I know what they're going to say is when they literally start talking. And so during prep time, not only do I have no idea, like not only do I have to like think about the motion and like prep, I also need to think about like what they might not say. And so as opening, you have the unique advantage of being the first team to talk, which means you do this thing called like matter loading, which is basically just trying to cram as much information as you can into your speeches, because that makes it really, really hard for the closing team to come up with new material, unique material. But even if they do come up with unique material, it's very hard for them to prove why that's more important if you were the first team and had like the best ideas. So in opening, prep time is key. You need to make sure that during prep time, you're thinking of like every possible idea that could be brought up and making sure you list like most of them in your speech, or at least the most important ones, and make it clear as to like why those are the biggest like ideas. Another reason why that's really important is because one of the disadvantages being on the opening side is like once you're done talking, you literally don't engage for the rest of this debate. You could hear people say like the worst things about your argument, but you just can't talk anymore because your speeches are over. And so it's like, honestly, it's really sad in a lot of debates to like go opening and then you stop talking and then you see a lot of stuff going on, but you like just can't be a part of any part of it.
You still with POIs.
Yeah, you can still like ask POIs and we'll go over that, but like it's still not the same as like having the ability to give a speech later, right? Especially when like someone's referencing something you said. So if you're like, if you are the first person to talk and you know there are 4 other people from the other team who are going to talk after you, what you say is probably going to have to be very strong so that it can withstand like 4 people like refuting it. Anyway, on to closing. So as the member of government or the member of opposition, which is the first speaker from the closing government or the closing opposition, literally the most important thing you need to do in your speech is an extension. And so that's extending the ideas of the debate. This is really hard to do because again, like we talked about, opening sites might just like cover the most important ideas. An extension can be a lot of things. It can be a new argument. It can be like some interesting piece of rebuttal, but usually it's like something that hasn't been discussed in the debate before. A weak extension would be to take something that's already been discussed and then just like expand on that more. Like worst comes to worst, you can do that, but really you're trying to bring up a new idea and that's your extension. And when you go up to give your member of government or member of opposition speech, you will explicitly state that you are extending the debate. So it's fine to be like, here is our extension to this debate, and then state your idea so that it's very, very clear as to like what you're bringing that's new to the debate. Because a lot of times, even if you do have like new ideas, because they're in like they're in a similar vein to like what's being discussed earlier, judges might find it difficult to know if you're like actually saying anything new or like repeating whatever was already said. So as the like member of government or member of opposition, there are other things you'll do, like you'll rebut the people who went before you, talk about like why the opening sides probably didn't do a good enough job of like setting up the debate. But the most important thing you need is an extension. If you do everything else right and don't have an extension, you'll just automatically lose because you're not helping extend the debate. Things to think about. What has not been discussed so far. So this is like a tricky thing to do because during prep time, you can't do that. Like all the other things we were talking about, you can think about them during prep time. But what's not been discussed so far, you can only think about during the actual debate. And so this might seem like a disadvantage, but I think like closing has its own advantage in that prep time is 15 minutes plus everybody else talking. So you do actually have like a lot of time to think about stuff. I think communicating is kind of hard sometimes because while people are talking, you need to communicate with your teammate about what you want your extension to be. And so usually a good strategy for like closing teams is to try to do the same thing that opening's doing. List as many ideas as you can that you think are relevant to the debate. Try to spend more time fleshing out the ideas that are probably less common, which opening won't bring up, but just have this list of ideas with you as the opening team's talking. And then as they keep like bringing up ideas from that, just keep striking stuff out and then see what you have left that you thought of that they didn't and try to run that as your extension. Or sometimes you might think of something else new during the debate and that might be better to run as an extension as well. Other reasons to consider these arguments more important than others, again, same thing. Very, very important to do in closing because you could have an extension, but it could be an extension nobody cares about. And it's very likely going to be that opening came up with the actual like biggest ideas in the debate. And so as a closing speaker, it's much harder for you to do this because obviously you're coming up with the thing that wasn't the first thing that came to like everybody's mind, but you still need to like show why that's important. A good example of this is like, let's say there's a debate and opening sides cover like all the mainstream arguments. If you have like an argument on how this benefits like minorities or like another community, that could be a good extension. And the way you'd prove it's more important is talk about how this community is like uniquely affected or like the most vulnerable group in this debate. And therefore why it's important to like focus on them. Because if they're vulnerable, then it means they're the ones who are like most affected by the topic in general and are less likely to be able to like use resources to get out of the problem you're talking about. And so that's kind of how you use your argument and make it seem more important than like whatever the opening says. Has there been adequate refutation with the opening team? So this is also a thing you can capitalize on. So if I'm closing opposition and I think opening opposition didn't do a good enough job of refuting opening government, in my closing opposition speeches, I can refute like both the government sides and make sure only by the closing side, it's become clear why their argumentation doesn't stand. So try to see if like this hasn't been done well enough. Also see if there's anything to clarify for your bench as a whole. This is something that happens a lot. So your opening teams might just be really bad and there's like nothing you can do about it. That just happens. So if that happens, there might be something you want to clarify for like your entire team, including the opening. Again, make sure you're not contradicting them when you do this, but it does look good to kind of like make some small clarifications because then it sets the stage for like a better closing debate. Okay, the last speaker role is government whip or opposition whip. As the whip, you're the last speaker talking for like your entire bench and your team. So at this point, the judges probably heard way too many arguments and way too many ideas. And they're not looking for like a fourth person to just come up and say more random stuff. So your goal here is to just make it very, very clear to the judge about why they should vote for you and why you won the debate. And so this is a very interesting role because you don't introduce a lot of new material. So yeah, you don't introduce new material or arguments. You do, however, you can introduce like new rebuttal or new ways to like categorize what other people have already said, but you don't introduce like new arguments itself. Because at that point, the judge is probably not going to listen to that because one, it's just way too late in the debate to bring it up. If you could have brought it up earlier, you should have. But also two, it's unfair to bring it up then because nobody actually gets the chance to like respond to whatever you're saying. So rule of thumb is to act like a biased judge. If you were a judge, how would you keep track of everything that happened in the debate? Try to keep track of the debate the same way. And then in your speech, you'll give a summary similar to what the judge would give after the debate. So if you guys have ever been in debates where after the debate, the judge gives you feedback and the judge is like, well, I voted for opposition because they did this better than government, but if government had done this, they would have won the debate. Basically, you give the entire, like you give the same speech, but you do it in a way that's biased towards your team. So like, this sounds very obvious, but when you do it, you want to try to make sure that you're really trying to do it in good faith, that you're not just like discounting the other team's arguments. You're clearly explaining what they said. So a lot of times people will like come in their whip speech and like just ignore some arguments that were made by like the other team and just focus on their own stuff. Like that is a part of it, but the best whip speech is one that will come up and be like, okay, they said all of this, but at the end of the debate, it doesn't stand or like, isn't that important because of like all the stuff we did. So make sure you're still comparing everything. Reiterate your team's extension. Again, the only way a closing team will win is if they have a good extension. That's like the bare minimum, and then everything else builds on top of that. So as the whip speaker, you're not only summarizing the debate, you want to bring your extension back up and talk about why you beat the opening sides. When you summarize the entire debate, make sure to include opening sides. So it's not just about like summarizing the second half of the debate, it's everything that's been said. And then weighing. So weighing is like very, very important. By that, what I mean is like, let's say A gives me an argument on why X is going to happen, and I have an argument on like why Y is going to happen. We might have like very good reasoning for why X is going to happen and why Y is going to happen, and like what the impacts of those are. But at that point, we're just like building two parallel worlds. And as the judge, I have no idea to know if I care about X more or if I care about Y more. So when you're weighing, you're saying, take what they said, this is what we said, this is why this is more important, or this is why this is more likely. And that comparison, again, is like something it's very, very easy to forget because you get so caught up in like making your own analysis and proving why what you said is right. So make sure everything you say is in the context of what the other team has said. And that's why as the like whip speaker, whose literal job is to summarize the entire debate, weighing is the most important thing you can do. Things to think about. These are just questions you can ask to like see how you would summarize the debate. Think about areas where you're winning, areas where you're losing. If there are areas where you're losing and you like, there are going to be like, I think in pretty much every debate, like every good debate at least, you're not going to be winning all the good ideas because then your like opponents are probably just bad. And so it's good to kind of like analyze which ideas you're winning, which ones you're losing, and then try to like mitigate the effects of that. So try to think about why the argument you're like losing isn't as important and how you can kind of like push that away from like the judge's decision. That's not to say you don't include that at all. You will still bring that idea up, but not like just don't focus on it as much as your strongest ideas. Make sure you're doing enough comparisons with the other team, and make sure by the end of your speech, it's very, very clear as to what your extension was and why that played a big role in the debate. Okay, last thing is points of information. But any questions on all this? Because I know that was a lot of information. Okay, cool. Points of information. Few things. So before that, points of information. So I mentioned before that like these debate formats don't have like a cross-examination round. So you just like give your speeches and that's it. You're not like, you don't have a round where you get to like ask them questions. The way they incorporate this in British Parliamentary is that when someone is speaking, you're allowed to stand up and ask them questions, which are called points of information. And so there are like a few rules which kind of govern what these questions are and when you can ask them those. The first rule is they should be short. So because you get only like 7 minutes to talk, when someone asks you a question, if that question is like 2 minutes long, then they're just wasting a lot of time for you to speak. So they're usually 15 seconds long. You want to try and write your question down so that when you ask them the question, you have something to read from. And usually if you ask like a really long question, the speaker can just be like, okay, you're wasting my time, or like, okay, I know what you're saying, please sit down, or something like that. So make sure you phrase your questions well and they're not too long. Unprotected time. So when a speaker is speaking, the first minute and the last minute are called protected time, which means when I start speaking and when I have a minute left to reach the 7-minute mark, that time is protected. So nobody can stand up and ask you a question during that period of time. And the reason for that is because that's when you're trying to like introduce a topic or like conclude. And so the idea is that you shouldn't be getting disturbed while you're doing that. And then from the first minute to the 6th minute, you can be asked like questions. So if I'm, wait, I'll actually explain that later. But cool, ask opposing sides. So this seems obvious, but there have been debates where I've seen the closing government team try and ask a POI to the opening government team just because they forget that like they're not allowed to do that, because you see someone talking and you're like, I want to ask them a question. Make sure you ask the other team questions. Oh, also points of information on questions that you have to take. So they're optional but recommended. So this is like a random like image from a debate where clearly all of these people have points of information to ask. First of all, this is bad practice. So like if you have a point of information to ask, usually both the people on the team wouldn't stand up to ask the question. You'd like discuss which question you want to ask, and then you'd have one person to stand. But here, I guess all 4 of them just had a question to ask. So the way it works is once protected time starts, which is like the 1st minute to the 6th minute, and the judge will usually like, they'll have like a timekeeper who like make a signal to tell you that you can ask questions. You would stand up and like raise your hand, and like literally, if I was sitting here, I'd get up and be like, point of information. Or I could just stand up just to make sure the speaker knows that I want to ask them a question. And like I said, it's optional. So the speaker doesn't have to take a point of information. You can take like no points of information during your entire speech. So you can just like ignore anyone who's standing up to try and ask you a question. But obviously that doesn't look good. So try to take like 1 or 2 points of information during your speech. As the person who's asking the point of information, try to get up like every 20 to 30 seconds with some kind of question to ask the other team, so that it looks like you're prepared and have something you want to ask them. And because like that's the only way for you to like directly engage with what they're saying. Because you can give a speech after whatever they say, but they don't have to necessarily respond to you directly. They can like ignore you, or like the judge is going to catch on to that, but like the only way you can get them to respond to something that you want them to talk about is by asking them a question. So points of information are very useful. We'll do a like workshop on points of information with rebuttal as well at some point, kind of show you what these questions look like. But you can just go to YouTube, search for like WUDC, which stands for the World Universities Debating Championship. The video I linked previously is also from that competition, so they have like an entire playlist of videos. But you can look at the kinds of questions people ask as points of information and see how they're useful. But yeah, the idea is you want to ask them a question that gets them to like make a concession, contradict something they said, or you just want them to say something that you can use in your speech later and talk about like why they shouldn't have said that or why that was bad. Okay, this is stuff I already said. It's the most direct way of engaging with them. There's also a lot of strategy involved, so you can look at which teams you want to target. Because if I'm an opening team, again, like I said, I don't get to like interact with the closing teams. So a good way to interact with them is asking points of information. The other side is true as well. If I'm a closing side, I'm only ever talking after another closing side. And so if I want to like, if I feel like opening government is doing a really, really good job, and I wish there was some way I could like argue with them, a good way would be to like ask them a point of information. Think about what issues you can get a direct response to. Don't just like state a fact or something and ask them what they think about it, because they'll just be like, oh, we don't really care, or like, we don't see why that's relevant. So unless your question is immediately like, unless it's immediately clear about why that's important, you wouldn't like ask a POI. Also think about like what you can clarify. Like if everybody's been like misunderstanding your argument and presenting it as something it's not, it might be a good idea to like kind of clarify that within like the phrasing of your question. Okay, cool. That was the end of the workshop, or like intro to DP presentation. So hopefully you guys know what British Parliamentary is. You can like keep this presentation whenever you like try to participate in a tournament, but I would highly recommend participating because one, like we just don't have selections, so you can just like be on the team and like go to competitions, and we're going to cover your entry fee. Also, two, it's like a 2-person team, so you don't even need that many people on a team. And honestly, I think for starting out, it's really nice to just have like a 2-person team because it's easier to like communicate with one person, and you also have like a bigger role to play in the debate, so you just get more experience. And if you know all of the things like on this workshop, you should be able to like figure out what exactly people are talking about or what like weird terminology they're using. But this is like one of the best ways to get experience because you're going against 3 different teams. So you have like a lot of exposure to other like good debaters or new debaters, and you can just like understand a lot about debate very quickly. So yeah, that's my recommendation. You guys have any questions? Okay, cool. That's it. You can email me here or text on Discord if you have any other questions.
All right. And there are British Parli tournaments coming up. So, if we have enough people, we can do a British Parli scrim next week, but that requires like 8, 9 people. So let's see. Is anyone thinking of going to the tournaments? Question mark.
Oh, Vishnesh, that's the guy that I said that you should talk to.
Oh, yeah. All right.
I'll think about the October 6th to 7th one. I do have to check my schedule, but it should be okay. The other one, I have like a bunch of exams.
Yeah, try and go to the my calendar. I'm really hoping to do a British Parli tournament because I really enjoyed the last one I did. Let's see.
You should go to Stephen. When's Stephen Classic?
Steve Hunt Classic is on the 7th. Wait, what was the last one you did?
Oh, yeah, actually,
I did the Fred Scheller. Oh, that one. Oh, thanks.
I actually really can't do that.
Yeah, neither can I.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, because you treat.
Yeah. The hips.
Andrew's like, oh, God, I made the best schedule for debate. So Andrew, no. I actually can't wait to this tournament.